So, we've reached the stage in the class when we're about to start talking about theism. Up to now, we've been talking about religions in general, and not all of the religions that we've looked at are theistic. Buddhism, for example, is clearly not theistic. Buddhism, notoriously, doesn't have a creator God figure. There are gods plural in Buddhism, but it is in theory possible for any one of us to become a god if we pass up the level of karma and rebirth. But becoming a god is not the goal of Buddhism. Even gods need to get off the cycle of birth and rebirth, samsara, the wheel, and achieve nirvana. So that's very different from the God of primarily the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's the same God in those three, and that God is the God of Theism. So a theistic religion is one that has this figure, God with a capital G. Not just a God with a small g, but God, the supreme being. Hinduism is an interesting case. It looks as if Hinduism certainly appears to Western eyes to be polytheistic, a bit like, the Norse gods or the Norse religions with Thor and Odin and all those guys, or the Greek and Roman gods, Zeus or Jupiter, where there seem to be plural gods. And certainly there are lots of named divine figures in Hinduism. But there are Vedantins, that is, theologians of Hinduism, who in fact say that no, really, there's one divine being, and that all of the named gods, like Vishnu, for example, are avatars of the one God. And in fact, some Hindus include figures like Jesus as an avatar of this one God. So Hinduism can incorporate other religions in that respect. So on that interpretation, Hinduism might be a theistic religion too. Okay, theism actually predates Christianity, certainly Judaism. It emerged out of Judaism, but also there's some indication that it was the influence of certain Greek philosophers, which is ironic because even in the time of the most famous Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, they still had the familiar gods of Zeus and those guys. But there is one pre-Socratic philosopher in particular called Xenophanes, who criticized the Greek gods and suggested that a divine being should be much more like the God of Theism. So there we see an early instance of the progression, you might say, from a polytheistic view to a monotheistic view where the God that should be like we're familiar with in modern Christianity. That view is called perfect being theology. And perhaps the person who did most to develop this, certainly in Christianity, is St. Thomas Aquinas. And he is the one who describes God as being perfect and God as having these familiar omnis. God is omnipotent, God is omniscient, God is omnibenevolent. Those three are perhaps the most important, and those are called the sort of core perfections. But there are other features as well. For example, God is supposed to be omnipresent, and God is either supposed to be eternal or everlasting, and we'll get into the difference between those in a second. So this idea, perfect being theology, perhaps the most basic idea of God is that he has got to be perfect. And from this feature of being perfect, Aquinas inferred that God must be these other things, like all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, omnipresent, all present everywhere, and so on. And that has informed our modern notion of what the God of the Abrahamic faith is like. And that's why they, in the excerpt I gave you from Stairs and Bernard, they point out that it's kind of weird in a Buffy series. I must say, I never watched Buffy, so I don't know. I can't confirm what they're saying, but apparently in an entire series of Buffy, she was at war with a being who was supposed to be a god of some alternative universe or something. And they point out, well, she must have been a god with a small g, because she can't have been God with a capital G, because if you're God with a capital G, you have these features. Now, this creates some problems for some of the religions. So, for example, Islam is very critical of Christianity because Christianity says that Jesus is God. And Muslim theologians are very scornful of this notion. It violates what they call Tawheed, which is the oneness of God, and in fact smacks of polytheism to say that there's God and Jesus and that they're one and the same. Islamic scholars say, well, that's not really possible, which is why, of course, Muhammad doesn't play the same role in Islam as Jesus does in Christianity. Jesus is supposed to be the Son of God and, in fact, God at the same time, which Muslims say is logically impossible, whereas Muhammad is just meant to be a prophet of God. The last and most important, but still just a man, just mortal and a prophet. Okay, so let's have a look at some of these properties that God is supposed to have. And in particular, let's look at some puzzles that arise from these very supposed properties. There are some puzzles that seem to show either that God couldn't have the features that God is supposed to have, or in fact that nobody could, and the very notions don't make sense. One of the most famous puzzles we're going to go into in a lot more detail, and that's called the problem of evil. And the problem of evil arises from the combination of these three. Very briefly, the problem of evil says if God is all-powerful, then God could prevent suffering. If God is all-knowing, God would know about every instance of suffering. None could escape God's notice. And if God is all-loving, then God would want to prevent all suffering. For example, if you could prevent all unnecessary suffering for your children because you love them, you would, if you could prevent it. And if you wouldn't, then what does that say about you? That says that maybe you're not as loving as you should be. But if God is perfectly loving and all-powerful, then there should be no suffering in this world, certainly no unnecessary suffering. And yet, clearly, there is suffering in vast amounts in this world, which seems to imply that God can't be at least one of those things. That's the problem of evil, and we'll talk about that later. But now let's handle these properties one at a time. Omnipotent, all-powerful. What does that mean? Well, it means having the most power possible. Well, what is it to have power? Usually the way this is interpreted is being able to do things. So the power that God has is an ability to do things. And if you're all-powerful, then there is literally nothing that you cannot do. And certainly that's supposed to be the feature, that's supposed to be a feature that God has. God is all-powerful. Now, there's a separate question that the readings don't really go into, which is why is it so important that this be true of God? Can't we just imagine a God who is not all-powerful? If as we'll see, it leads to apparent puzzles, isn't the simplest solution just to say, okay, God's not all-powerful. He's super-duper powerful, but he's not all-powerful. Well, there are huge disadvantages if you take that feature away from God. If God is not all-powerful, then maybe God can't save us. Maybe the things are not going to end up right. Maybe God can't make even heaven a perfect place. Maybe the world is doomed and there's nothing God can do to prevent it. It's very important to us that God be able to solve all problems and that there is nothing that God can't do. That's why omnipotence is so important to us. And that's quite apart from Aquinas' point that if God is perfect, then he has to be all-powerful. Because you might ask, well, why is it important that God be perfect? If anything, it's more important that God be omnipotent than that he be perfect. Okay, so we're working with a definition that says something like being able to do anything. And this leads, of course, to classic puzzles. If God can do anything, then he can make a square circle. So if you make something circle, then it's not a square. Or, if you have trouble with that, like a triangle. Can you make a four-sided triangle? No, of course you can't, because if you give something four sides, it's not a triangle. Well, says this criticism, then God isn't omnipotent, I guess, because he can't do this. Now, there is a reply that is generally considered acceptable. Well, there's two possible replies. One, of course, is to say he can make a four-sided triangle, and the fact that you can't imagine it, it just shows that you're a limited mortal. And that's something like what Harry Frankfurt suggests in the very short article that's a response to the George Mavrides article. The downside of saying this is that would make God completely incomprehensible to us. Now, a lot of theologians say, God is incomprehensible to us. God moves in mysterious ways. Don't trouble your puny human brain with it. He's got it. But if God is literally self-contradictory, so he can make a four-sided triangle, then maybe we think he's good, but that doesn't mean that he will treat us nicely. Maybe it is possible for him to be good and at the same time torture us constantly. That seems to be inconsistent to us, but if God can be inconsistent, then that is entirely possible. So if God is completely inconsistent and not bound by the laws of logic, then we kind of lose all motivation to worship him. There's no rules. God could give us rules and tell us to do things and then violate the rules all the time without being inconsistent. So there's a huge cost to saying that God can violate the laws of logic. And Thomas Aquinas, the saint of Catholic theologians, influential to this day, refuses to believe that God can violate the laws of logic. So that leaves us with the position that God can't make a square circle. Does this mean he's not omnipotent? The usual response that is generally accepted is to say, no, God is all-powerful in the sense of being able to do anything, but impossibilities are not things. They are, in George Mavrides' term, pseudo-tasks. So making a square circle is a pseudo-task because there is nothing that would count as success. Suppose I was told to go away and make a square circle. There's nothing that I could produce that would count as success. So therefore, you literally cannot do the task. So it is not a task. So therefore, the fact that God can't do it doesn't mean that there's a task that he can't do because it's not a task. Okay, so that's the usual response to the square circle. But what about this other one, the stone? What stone, you ask? Well, a stone so heavy that he can't lift it. Now, this doesn't seem to be logically inconsistent in the same way like a square circle or a triangle with four sides. It's perfectly easy. While we cannot possibly imagine a triangle with four sides, it's perfectly easy to imagine a stone too heavy for me to lift. There's a lot of stones that are like that. So it doesn't seem to be a pseudo-task in that respect. So then the challenge is, can God make a stone too heavy for God to lift? Why is this a challenge to his omnipotence? Because, well, there's two possibilities. Either he can make the stone. Okay, good, he can make the stone. That is something that he can do. But then he can't lift it because, by definition, he has made a stone that is too heavy for him to lift. So there now exists something that he cannot do, which is lift the stone. So clearly, he's not all-powerful. There's something he can't do. Alternatively, we can say, no, he can't make the stone. But then, of course, there's something he can't do, which is make the stone. So either way, there's something he can't do, which appears to show that God can't be omnipotent, because either he can't make the stone or he can't lift the stone. Now, if this challenge worked, it would show not just that God is not omnipotent, but that it is impossible for anybody or anything to be omnipotent. It's not a concept that makes sense. But George Mavrides comes up with this response where he says, actually, this is a disguised version of the square circle. It doesn't sound like it's like the square circle because, like I said, I can imagine a stone too heavy for me to lift. But that's a stone too heavy for me to lift. Whereas a stone too heavy for an omnipotent being to lift is a logical impossibility. So in that sense, it's just like a square circle. Because literally there is nothing that could be too heavy for an all-powerful God to lift. So therefore, the correct answer to the question, can he make a stone that's too heavy for him to lift, is no, he can't, in exactly the same way that he can't make a square circle. It's an impossibility. A stone too heavy for a being that can lift anything to lift is impossible. Now, so God can't do that. But God can make any size stone, and God can lift any size stone. So that doesn't seem to be really an important restriction on his power. That's the suggestion. Frankfurt gives kind of a cheeky response. He says Mavrides seems to be agreeing with St. Thomas Aquinas that God is bound by the laws of logic. And he says, okay, maybe he is, but some philosophers disagree, most famously Descartes, and he gives a bunch of quotes from letters Descartes wrote that seem to suggest that Descartes believes that God can violate the laws of logic. And he says, Mavrides' way of dealing with the puzzle relies on the principle that an omnipotent being need not be supposed capable of performing tasks whose descriptions are self-contradictory. And Frankfurt says, okay, but what if you're like Descartes and you disagree with that? Does that mean that God can't be omnipotent? And he said, no, actually, that means that God can be omnipotent because he can make a stone that's too heavy for him to lift, and he can lift a stone that's too heavy for him to lift. Both of those things are contradictory, but so what? We've just said that God is not bound by the laws of logic. If God is supposed capable of performing one task whose description is self-contradictory, that of creating the problematic stone in the first place, why should he not be supposed capable of performing another, that of lifting the stone? If an omnipotent being can do what is logically impossible, then he can not only create situations which he cannot handle, but also he can handle situations that he cannot handle. That's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but that's what happens when you say that God can violate the laws of logic. But anyway, Mavrides' solution is generally considered to be a pretty good one. That basically it's not really a real task to make a stone too heavy for God to lift, because it's a self-referential task. It's referring to God's own nature in the description of the task. So it's a bit like saying, can you do something that you can't do? Well, no, but that doesn't mean doesn't seem to be a restriction on your power, because if you're God, there's nothing that you can't do. So of course you can't do something that doesn't exist. So it's kind of it's not a real challenge to God. So far, omnipotence looks like it's It survives these challenges. But later on, we'll see there are some restrictions that that philosophers put on omnipotence other than this, that come up, for example, in discussions of the problem of evil. Can God make someone do something of their own free will? A lot of philosophers believe that no, God can't do that. Because if God makes you do it, you're not doing it of your own free will. So is that a limit on God's power? And one thing that was not mentioned, how about sinning? There's something that we're all very good at. We're all perfectly capable of sinning. Can God do that? I mean, here's something. I can't create a square circle. I can't make a stone too heavy for me to lift. Well, I probably could if you gave me some cement. But I can't make a stone so heavy that an omnipotent being can't lift it. So those are things I can't do. But sinning, hey, no problem. I can do that. So there's something I am perfectly able to do. If God can't do that, then that does seem a serious restriction. If there's something I can do that God can't do, then that definitely seems to make him not omnipotent. And it's an open question. Can God sin? Well, in some sense he can't, because if he does it, then it's not a sin. But suppose we say, can God, be needlessly cruel? There's something that I can do easily. I hope I don't do it, but it's certainly possible. Be needlessly cruel. Can God do it? In some sense he can't, because if he's perfect, then that is no part of perfection. That is not something that a God by definition can do. Well, that seems to be a restriction on his power, doesn't it? Now, some people say in response to this, well, he could do it. It's just he would never do it. But then if you push at the idea of what could means, then you would say, it's only true that you could do something if there is some possible world in which you do it. Okay, I need to do a quick sidebar on possible worlds, because these come up all the time in philosophy, particularly these days. A possible world is like an alternate universe, a parallel, Marvel's done a good job of introducing the general public to this with the metaverse. So the metaverse is all these possible universes, where in one universe, Spider-Man is Peter Parker, in another he's Miles Morales, in another he's Peter Parker, only fatter and older, if that animated Spider-Man is any guide. And in another one he's black and white and he's voiced by Nick Cage. So there are all these alternate universes. All right. Could it be true? Could the Germans have won World War II? In some sense, we say yes, they could have. They didn't, thankfully, but they could have. Why is it true that they could have? And the thing that makes it true that they could have, according to philosophers, is that there's an alternate universe. Now, whether or not that universe really exists is a matter of some dispute. A guy called David Lewis, who just died recently, said, they're all real, it's just only ours is the actual one, but theirs is the actual one for theirs. So there really is another universe in which the Germans won World War II. It's just we can't get at it. It's a parallel universe. Other philosophers say, no, they're not real. Ours is the only real one. And in fact, that view is much more consistent with theism. You have to say that ours is the only actual one, because otherwise God has created universes of unimaginable cruelty, much worse than ours, and they really exist. And then the problem of evil is even worse. Got sidetracked. Okay, so parallel universe. So this notion is used to explain the notion of whether or not I could do something. So suppose I never actually visit Mount Everest. Could I visit Mount Everest? Well, yes, but I never do. Well, what explains the fact that I could? The answer is, in some parallel universe, somebody just like me, or in some versions of the theory it actually is me, visits Mount Everest. And that proves that I could. So you can know that the statement, I could visit Mount Everest, is true precisely because there is a possible world in which I do. Bring this back to whether or not God can sin. If you say God could sin, he just never does, well, the only way to explain that he could is if there's a possible world in which he actually does. But according to perfect being theology, there isn't a possible world in which God does it. He is not just perfect, which means that he's perfect in this world. He is necessarily perfect, which means perfect in every possible world. So what that means is there is no possible world in which he sins, which means he can't sin. Not just that he doesn't sin, but he literally cannot sin. That seems to be a limit on his power. All right, I'm going to get to omniscient next because that's got the interesting puzzles. But before I do, I want to say a little bit about these others. Omnibenevolent means all-loving. There's a problem that this might be inconsistent with another feature of God, that God is perfectly just. Now, perfectly just means giving everybody exactly what they deserve. So, for example, if a judge is perfectly just, then you get the perfect sentence for what you've done. Nobody gets too much, and most importantly, nobody gets less than they deserve. So, nobody gets mercy, because mercy is getting less than you deserve. If somebody is merciful on you, you deserve something bad, and they don't give it to you. That's what mercy is. But isn't omnibenevolence involving mercy? If you love someone, you show them mercy. You take it easy on them. So, and isn't God supposed to be, certainly in Christianity, one of the key features of Christianity is forgiveness. And if forgiveness happens, all of your sins are washed away. In fact, that's part of the story of what Jesus did for mankind. But that's inconsistent with perfect justice. So so again, this is another case where two features ascribed to God appear to be in conflict. Omnipresent. What does that mean? Well, it has been interpreted in different ways. I think Aquinas, it's either Aquinas or Augustine, who's the other great. Aquinas is sort of the Middle Ages, and Augustine is like the 300s, so much earlier than Aquinas. And Augustine was more influenced by the philosopher Plato, and Aquinas was more influenced by the philosopher Aristotle. But one of them puzzled, maybe God being omnipresent means God is suffused throughout all of existence like a fine mist. You know, like a mist expands to fill a room, and so there's particles of the mist in every corner of the room. Is that what it means to say that God is omnipresent? And I think it was Augustine who said, no, that can't be right, because then there would be more God in a hippopotamus than there is in a sparrow. So a hippopotamus would be, in some sense, be more godly. And he didn't like that idea. So the notion in which God is omnipresent is also kind of a mystery. It's not the sense in that he's spread out like a mist, because that would mean that God had a particular location as well, and as God is part of his creation. So that's kind of puzzling too. Eternal and everlasting. Yes, God is supposed to be one of these. There's never been a moment at which God didn't exist. That's generally accepted. But the difference between eternal and everlasting is in their answer to this question: is God in time? Everlasting says yes. So everlasting means God exists in time and experiences it as we do. there's a huge philosophy of time, and my former colleague, now retired, Nathan Oaklander, still writing. Google Nathan Oaklander and you will see tons of stuff on the philosophy of time. And philosophers divide views of time into several camps now, but there's two main camps, which is A series and B series. According to A series, we exist in something called the present, which is sort of a moving now. It's as if what was future is becoming present and then it becomes past. We are in the present, though. We are located in the present. We don't exist in the past. There's some. Does the past exist? A branch of A series called presentism says no, the past doesn't exist. And of course, the future, most people say, doesn't exist. Okay, so everlasting appears to be most easily compatible with that view of time. So God exists in the here and now like we do, and he's always existed and he always will exist. The alternative view of time is called B series, and according to a B series view of time, time is like space. So just as I am in a particular location in space, but that doesn't mean that over there doesn't exist just because I'm not there. Over there does exist, over there exists, over there exists. All of these things exist, it's just that I'm not there. But it all exists. And according to B series view of time, the universe is a four-dimensional object. It's not just goes out in all directions, it exists in its entirety from its beginning to its end, like as an object. And on the eternal view of time, God is outside of time, and so he doesn't experience, I'm using the pronoun he, just because that was my upbringing in the Church of England, but of course that's another feature of God. God doesn't really have a gender. A gender or a sex is something that creatures only have because they need to reproduce. And of course God doesn't reproduce, so God doesn't have a gender. And if both men and women are supposed to be made in God's image, so in some sense God must be, at least according to Christianity, so in some sense God must have aspects of both. But I'm just more familiar with the tradition, so don't read anything into it when I say he. Anyway, God is outside of time, and so God can see, as it were, the entire history of the universe laid out before him. He can see the time of the dinosaurs. He can see the Big Bang. He can see the end of the universe as it winks out of existence. He can see every event in your life, from your birth, maybe from your conception, to when you become soil, or whatever happens to you after you die. You can see all of that at once. That's more consistent with him being eternal. Now, there are advantages to each. The advantage of eternal is that it's consistent with the idea that God is unchanging. Why should God be unchanging? Well, it appears to say that he is in the Bible, for one thing. Stairs and Bernard give you the particular passage. But also, if God is perfect, then why would God ever change? Because God has got all the perfect qualities, so why would he acquire new ones? And if he could acquire new ones, doesn't that mean that before he was lacking something and therefore that he wasn't perfect? So getting change and perfection to be consistent with each other is a puzzle in itself. So it seems to suggest that God shouldn't change. But if God is in time, then one thing at least changes about God, what time it is for God. So God appears to, and God, the relationship to the universe changes, because God would be related to the universe as it exists at one moment, and the universe is changing. So the eternal notion of time appears to have some advantages. But as we shall see, that has effects on human freedom just as much as omniscience does. Anyway, those are the two notions. If God is everlasting, then God experiences time as we do. It's this particular day, hour of this particular day for God just as much as it is for us. Although, of course, once you learn about Einstein, that's pretty difficult given that it's different times and different places in the universe. So I don't know how that works because I never really understood physics after Newton. But just so long as you understand the difference. All right, back to omniscience. Now, there are some puzzles with omniscience that have nothing to do with foreknowledge, but they're not talked about much. Some of them are a bit like the same puzzle with omnipotent. As I said, there's something we can do which is sin that it appears to be impossible for God to do. There seems to be some things we can know that seem to be things that God couldn't know. Feelings appear to be features of imperfect beings. Certainly negative feelings like jealousy or envy, which are not the same thing, rage, hatred, all of these things are negative feelings which are improper for a perfect being to experience. So just as God can't sin, it seems like God can't know what it's like. That's a kind of knowledge, isn't it? To know what it's like to feel hatred or those kind of things. That appears to be a problem for a perfect being. Can God know, like I know that I'm late for the test, or I know that the test is next week. That is a kind of knowledge that is relative to a particular point in time. To have that piece of knowledge, you have to be located in a moving now. It has to be the A series, and you're existing in the present. So if God is eternal, then it seems like God could not have that kind of knowledge because God is outside of time. It's not that time. So God can know that, for example, the D-Day happened on, I'm afraid, I don't know, is it 1942? No, 1944? Anyway, I should have picked a day that I actually know. I know, the moon landing, didn't that happen on July 20th, 1969? Okay, so God knows that Neil Armstrong sets foot on the moon on July 20th, 1969, but he never has the experience of knowing that that's about to happen, which of course Neil Armstrong had on July 19th, my birthday. He knew that he was going, or he had the knowledge that he was scheduled. He didn't know that he absolutely would step on the moon, but he knew that he was scheduled to. And that's something that God couldn't know. All right, so both of these are puzzles. Can God know them? The big puzzle with omniscience involves foreknowledge. If God knows everything, then presumably he knows what's going to happen just as much as what has happened. And this is particularly true if God is eternal. Because if God is eternal, then facts about the future are just as obvious to him as facts about the past. They're all laid out. He can just see what's happening in the future in the same way that he can see what's happening in the past. It's all visible to him, as it were, at once. So now actually that is a reply that this guy, and I'm never sure how to pronounce this, Boethius or Boethius, I should look it up. But let me give you the puzzle first of all. The puzzle is, if God knows what's going to happen, then he knows what you're going to do before you do it. So for example, I just raised my hand. I think I did that freely. I thought, hey, Simon, do you want to raise your hand? Sure, let's do it. Okay, so I think I did that freely. But could I have not done that, given that God knew that I would? Well, it seems like that I couldn't not do it. Because if God knew before I did it, because he had foreknowledge, if God knew before I did it that I would do it, well, I can't not do it then, because God knows that I will do it. And knowledge is of things that are true. So God knows that I will raise my hand, so therefore I raise my hand. I have no option about this. There is no possibility of me not raising my hand. But isn't that inconsistent with our notion of freedom? Our notion of freedom says, I'm only free if I have some options, if I either could or I could not do it. So if I'm forced in some sense to raise my hand, then it's not free. Well, now God is not forcing me. Let's be clear. God is not forcing me. Well, there's a sense in which he is, because he made the universe and he made the laws which govern it and blah, blah, blah. So, and before he made the universe, he knew that I would do that. So in some sense, he kind of is. But so let's say at time t, before I raise my hand, God knows that I will raise my hand. Now, he knows that. I cannot change that. I cannot affect that. But that means before I raise my hand, that I have to raise my hand. So at the moment I raise my hand, there is no way for me not to do that. That appears to mean that I am not free, that I am sort of swept along in a tide of fate. That means that I'm not really master of my own fate. And given that God created the universe and sort of the circumstances of my existence, then it seems like, in some sense, everything I do is God's fault. So if I do something bad, it's because he made this way. And furthermore, he knew when he made me that I would do that. He had foreknowledge. He has foreknowledge of what I'll do before he creates the universe. So God is sitting there thinking, what universe shall I create? Shall I create this universe? Before he makes it, he knows if he makes that universe that I will do everything that I ever do at what point. He has all that knowledge at once. And then he creates the universe and I do it. Sounds like he's responsible for everything I do, which of course is a problem for a lot of areas of religion. It doesn't make sense for God to punish me or reward me. It doesn't make sense for God to punish me for what I do or reward me if I do good. That would be me like programming a robot to do certain things. Like I program a robot to help little old ladies across the road, and then I say, oh good, I will reward you with perpetual happiness for doing that. Why? I just programmed it. It wasn't up to the robot. Or if I program a robot to mug little old ladies, and then I say, oh, bad robot, you are terrible, I'm sending you to robot hell. It doesn't make any sense. It's on me for what the robot does. So this is a big problem if God's foreknowledge undermines human freedom. So unsurprisingly, a bunch of religious thinkers have tried to come up with responses to this that preserve God's omniscience without this implication that it undermines human freedom. One early answer by Berthius, or whatever his name is to suggest that God's being eternal and therefore not in time provides a solution. He says God doesn't really have foreknowledge because foreknowledge requires that God existed in time before the event. But of course, if God is outside of time, then God doesn't exist before it or after it. There is no relationship. God is not part of time. And actually, God being outside of time kind of makes a lot more sense, is much more compatible with the Einsteinian view of the universe. Because according to Isaac Newton, space and time are independent things. So time exists eternally, and then God can create the universe at a certain moment in time. So according to Newton's view of time, in theory, there could be a sort of cosmic date at which God created the universe and before which the universe, time existed without the universe. But according to Einstein, space and time are dependent on each other. There isn't space and time, there's one thing called space-time. And if creating the universe doesn't just create space and all of the physical objects in it. It creates time as well. Time is a feature of the universe that cannot exist without the universe. That kind of messes with the idea of God being everlasting, because if God creates the universe, then in some sense God creates time. So how can God be in time? It's as if God would be trapped in his own creation. So I've never understood how everlasting is compatible with Einstein. I'm sure somebody's got an answer. Being eternal seems to make more sense, God being outside of time. So if God is outside of time, then he doesn't have foreknowledge. But as Linda Zagzesby, a friend of mine actually was a colleague of Linda Zagzebski, so I should know how to pronounce her name. As she says, this doesn't really solve the problem, because you can just restate the problem in terms of God timelessly knowing that I would raise my hand. Even if God doesn't know before I raise my hand, God knows that I have to raise my hand, so in some sense I don't have an option. If God knows that I do it, it looks like there's no way I can't do it. Now, I think that's a little quick, and you could probably say in response, well, look, I know that Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon. He can't not do it now because he did it. And I know facts about the past. That doesn't mean that those people in the past, because I know that they did what they did, that doesn't mean that they didn't do it freely. And maybe God knowing facts about what I do relative to my future is like my knowledge of the past. I can have knowledge of things people do in the past without that knowledge undermining their freedom. Maybe the idea is that God's knowledge being outside of time, everything is like the past to him. I think that's probably what defenders of that view argue. Anyway, another attempt, which I've always struggled with, is William of Ockham's. And William of Ockham says, there are certain things that God can know about the future for sure, which are hard facts. So God's foreknowledge, God can know certain facts. No, let's put it this way. God's knowledge of certain things called hard facts are just about facts about the past. And you and I can know them, and God can know them. Now, there are certain things that God knows in the past that are soft facts. And they are soft facts because they contain an element that is about the future. And the problem of foreknowledge conflicting with human liberty concerns soft facts. So, for example, the problem is that God knows at, 2 hours ago, God knew that I would raise my hand. Now, according to Occam, this is a soft fact because part of it relies on me actually raising my hand. So God can know that without it forcing me to raise my hand. I still freely raise my hand, and that's what makes it true. And its truth is something that God knows, but him knowing the truth doesn't make me raise my hand, I guess is the idea. But again, this seems like a kind of a cheat, and it's, as Zagzebski says, it's hard to draw the distinction between soft and hard facts. Once you push at the definition, either everything counts as a soft fact or everything counts as a hard fact. And the fact remains, you can still ask, did God know it? Well then, I wasn't free. There was only one thing I could do. If at that moment you could have asked God, or God could have written down on a piece of paper, he raises his hand, and then I raise my hand, and you open the paper, and of course it says that. So there's ways to set it up so that God knows in a way that is testable before I do it. And then it seems like there's only one thing I can do. An interesting response is the open theism response. This is theologically interesting in a lot of ways. It requires a bunch of things. One thing it requires is that God be everlasting. Open theism requires that God be in time with us. And according to open theism, God is omniscient. because he has to be, because he's God, but doesn't have foreknowledge. Wait a minute, how is that possible? How can you be all-knowing without knowing what's going to come? Well, the answer is a bit like the way that God can be omnipotent without being able to make a square circle. He can't make a square circle because it's impossible, and therefore him not being able to do it doesn't mean that he can't do everything possible. This is a pseudo-task, remember. Well, open theists say the same thing about foreknowledge of human action, because here's what they say. They say humans have free will. Free will literally means that what I do is entirely up to me, so that nobody could know what a truly free person will do before they do it. They can guess. I mean, for example, if you know someone really well, you can make very good predictions. And of course, God knows you as well as anybody. God knows you as well as you know yourself. But you can surprise even yourself. You can do things thinking, I didn't know I was going to do that. And if you can surprise yourself, well then, even God, who knows you as well, perhaps even better than you know yourself, might not be able to know that you are going to do that. So, even God can't know for certain what a truly free person will do before they do it. Because it is impossible to know. Therefore, because it is impossible to know it, him not being able to know it doesn't mean that he's omniscient, because he can know everything that it is possible to know. Just like an omnipotent being can be able to do everything that it is possible to do and not be able to make a square circle. So, according to the open theists, an omniscient being can know everything that is possible to know without being able to know what a free person will do before they do it. So, this is a response that means that God can be omniscient without that impacting human freedom. So that is theologically a very useful position to have, because then it means there is a point to God rewarding us if we do right and punishing us if we do wrong, because it's genuinely not up to him and he can't even predict it before it happens. However, it has some dangerous implications, and the dangerous implications are you can surprise God. So God can make a pretty good plan for the future, the future of the universe. Remember, God's got a plan for the future, but it's still possible that it goes wrong. It's still possible that we screw up so badly that we undermine God's plan for the universe. That, in theory, is possible, according to open theism. Now, of course, open theists could, if they wanted, say, hey, this has happened before. Remember the flood? God made the universe and expected us to do right, but then we were so awful that he had to destroy all life except for Noah on the planet, Noah and, the pairs of animals or whatever, and start again. If God could predict what we would do in advance, that wouldn't have happened. He wouldn't have needed to flood the universe. So an open theist can point to the biblical flood story as kind of evidence and support of their version. Another problem with open theism, though, is that it seems to suggest that our free action is a little bit random. Now, this will get into a discussion of freedom that is very complicated, and there's a huge literature. They have what's called a libertarian view of freedom, which means that if you are truly free, then in one universe, somebody with exactly the same as you would do one thing, and in another parallel universe, somebody who has all the same features would do another. That has to be possible if you're truly free. In other words, your entire nature does not determine whether you will or won't do one particular thing. Critics of that view of freedom says that's not freedom, that's just randomness. I think freedom, says this view, I think freedom requires that my actions are the result of my beliefs and desires and wants and so on, so that what it is to be free is to believe something and want something and then do that because of them. Whereas this version of freedom sounds like things just happening to me. I want something, I desire it, but it's entirely possible I'll do the opposite. That doesn't sound like freedom. That sounds like things just happening to me. So that's a criticism of the notion of freedom that open theism is committed to. That's a lot to digest, but those are the basics of the features of God that perfect being theology is committed to. There you go.